Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Mike. You guys are welcome with me on Mike's Intellectual Corner. On today's episode, we are diving into a new series. This is Simple History. This is the real battle royale Squid game, the Nazino Island Tragedy 1933. Without further ado, we're just going to dive right into it. Let's roll.
The real-life battle royale, Nazino, Russia, 1933. On May 18, 1933, on the direct orders of Stalin himself, 5,000 men and women arrived at Nazino, a small isolated island on the river Orb, deep in the remote and barren wilderness of western Siberia. Within a matter of weeks, 4,000 of them would either just die from exposure, disappear, drown, or be eaten. This was the real-life battle royale.
I don't know a whole bunch on, obviously the deepness on how horrible the Soviet Union really was. Because obviously some of that stuff is, top secret and hidden and all that stuff. But, from what I know, he was really into getting a lot of the higher-ups, political and stuff like that, out of there and into these different situations and to gulags and stuff like that. Because obviously he didn't want any competition. He just wanted to stay in that power, like a dictatorship and stuff.
Battle Royale. The Soviet Union was a miserable place to live during this period, with severe food shortages which resulted in millions of people dying of starvation. Any form of criticism of the state was dealt with brutally, where the offender would probably get a life sentence and be sent to a gulag, where they would literally be worked to death carrying out hard labor. Stalin's purge of the so-called socially harmful elements of society mainly concentrated on certain groups, such as the Cossacks, ethnic minorities, intellectuals, and the kulaks, who were peasants who owned their own land and were sometimes hesitant in contributing a share of their goods to the common collective. Even the armed forces were not exempt, as mass purges were commonplace,
Which is crazy too, because you gotta think this is coming from Stalin, somebody who is indulgent in the Russian, country as a whole. Somebody who, once said that they would give up their family because their family is Russia and stuff like that. But yet he's treating the Russian people like this. It's kind of messed up,
Mass purges were commonplace, which normally resulted in the execution of its most experienced officers. The Nazino settlers also included a wide cross-section of urban society, not just criminals and vagrants, but also regular workers, children, and pensioners. Many were taken simply because they had failed to obtain an internal passport. However, others included a party member who had stepped out of her apartment without her party card, a worker buying cigarettes who had left his passport at home, a 12-year-old girl waiting at a train station while her mother bought bread, as well as the pregnant wife of a naval officer and a 103-year-old man. None of them were pioneers ready to settle and farm a harsh and unforgiving land. In February 1933, the head of the secret police, Genrik Yagoda, and the head of the Gulag labor camp system, Matvey Berman, got together and approached Stalin with a plan to resettle 2 million of these people into what was thought to be the vast area of untapped natural resources in Siberia and Kazakhstan. However, the environment was harsh and extremely cold, and much of the area was tundra and frozen all year round. Even when it...
Yeah, I think a main reason why they really wanted that land, I want to say they found diamonds on the Republic of Sakha by the Yakuts, by the city of Yakuts, if I'm not mistaken. But that might be until later that they did that, though. But I'm not 100%.
Tundra and frozen all year round. Even when it did thaw out in the summer, the ground became swampy and infertile and unsuitable for any kind of agriculture. To add to this, the air would have been thick with mosquitoes. One of the areas that was chosen for the project was Nazino Island, which was on the north bank of the Orb River, deep inside the Siberian wilderness. The island was only ever visited by the local Ostyak people from the nearby village of Nazino to gather tree bark to use as firewood. It was relatively small, measuring just 2 miles or about 3.2 kilometers long and 650 yards or 595 meters wide, and mostly made up of inhospitable swampland. Hunting and foraging was going to be nearly impossible. Many thousands of the so-called undesirables, which also included hardened and petty criminals by now, were being held in overcrowded prisons in Moscow and Leningrad. So, in the spring of 1933, they were loaded into all sorts of railway carriages, which included cattle trucks, and began a 10-day journey to Tomsk, where the half-completed transit camps were waiting for them. During the journey, gangs of criminals...
This is just crazy to me too. And I feel like in the USSR's constitution or whatever, it literally says that, saying they will protect all different ethnic groups and stuff like that. But then we see here that they're sending them to different gulags and stuff out there. It's kind of messed up when you really think about it.
During the journey, gangs of criminals systematically beat up and robbed their fellow passengers. On May 14, 1933, after the prisoners had been processed and selected, 5,000 of these settlers set off on their journey to Nazino Island. They were loaded onto river barges that had only been designed to carry timber down the River Orb and were only given 200 grams of bread each a day for the 5-day journey. By the time they had arrived at Nazino, 30 people had died on the barges, and a third of them were too weak to even stand. The authorities had failed to provide any form of shelter on the island, nor any basic tools or building materials to construct basic shelters against the elements. On their first night there,
Well, obviously, it's because their government didn't want them to survive. They didn't want them to build a colony out there. They just wanted them to die, obviously, because, damn, even Britain freaking set up their damn penal colonies for success. This is just ridiculous,
elements. On their first night there, it snowed heavily, and almost 300 people had frozen to death by the morning from exposure. This happened every night, and some people were actually burned alive from laying too close to the campfires that they had made to try to keep themselves warm. 20 tons of flour had been left on the island for the settlers, but straight away fights broke out when guards tried to distribute it daily, and they ended up firing at the mob to break them up. As no ovens were available there to make bread or anything else, the settlers either ate the flour raw or mixed it with dirty water from the river, and this led to an outbreak of dysentery.
And seeing the whole time, I'm over thinking, where the fuck are the ladies that were there, picking up getting the firewood and stuff like that from the local village? Where the fuck were they? Or maybe help out a little bit and be like, hey, you might not want to drink that water. This one's good though. Something, I don't know. They're probably like, nah, fuck it, I'm going near that.
To an outbreak of dysentery. Daily fighting soon broke out over whatever resources were still available, and killings became commonplace, and the bodies were robbed of any possessions they had, including money and especially gold fillings and crowns from their mouths.
For what? What the hell are you going to do with a gold filling and money in essentially a post-apocalyptic setting like this, where there's no stores, no nothing, and you're pretty much going to be eating each other by the end of it? You know what I'm saying? What good is money? That has to be the dumbest thing I've ever heard.
Crowns from their mouths. To add to all this misery, 9 days later, another 1,200 settlers arrived on the island, and very quickly groups of rival gangs started to form, and murder and extortion became commonplace. In desperation, many of the settlers tried to construct crude rafts out of pieces of wood that they could find to flee the island, but they were so basic that they were not fit for purpose and they just sank. So they simply drowned in the ice-cold river and their bodies were washed up on the shore along the River Orb. If they did manage to reach the opposite bank of the river alive, the guards would go and hunt them down for sport, and no questions were ever asked as to what had happened to them. Because of the lack of sanitation, there was soon an outbreak of typhus.
Yeah, I would actually really like to figure out, what the heck did the local villagers think of all this? Because obviously, they heard things, they saw, freaking 5,000, 10,000 people coming to this little island. They saw this happening, so I wonder what they're thinking at this time. They're probably scared out of their mind.
Because of the lack of sanitation, there was soon an outbreak of typhus, which many succumbed to because of their already weak state of health. But far worse was to come, because within a week, a doctor discovered cases of cannibalism beginning to appear on the island as people became desperate to find something to eat. It started out with cutting slices of flesh from the dead corpses and cooking them, but then progressed to killing people who were so weak or were so close to death, and therefore so vulnerable and unable to defend.
And it's crazy too, because as I'm sure a lot of us already know, human meat And I don't know why. It's something to do with the proteins in it or something like that, but it's not good for consumption. The proteins in it does something to your brain. It makes you go crazy, which is obviously not the best situation for this right here because, yeah, they're already crazy enough.
Themselves. When one survivor was asked if he had eaten human flesh while on the island, he replied that he had only eaten livers and hearts, and then only from people who were dying anyway. Another incident involved a young woman who was having a relationship with one of the guards. When he was not around to protect her, some men tied her to a tree, killed her, and cut off everything from her body that they could eat. Despite the many arrests and executions by the guards, the situation was brought under control when, after a damning internal report was submitted, it was decided to abandon the settlement on Nazino Island only after a month after it had been set up. Approximately 1/3 of the settlers had died.
And I'm trying to think too, where the heck were the guards and the doctors and stuff? Where were they living at? Because obviously they weren't living, unless they went crazy too, but obviously not. So like, where were they living at? It's kind of one of my questions here.
Approximately 1/3 of the settlers had died, while another third were reported as missing, possibly escaped, drowned, or eaten. Just over 2,000 people had survived. Unknown to the settlers at the time, all of their hardships had been in vain, as back in Moscow there had been a change in policy, and Stalin and the authorities had decided to cancel the whole settler experiment program.
That shit doesn't even make sense anyway. Why the hell would they pick that small island that obviously wasn't inhabited, didn't have any animals on it? You know what I'm saying? Why would they pick that little island to inhabit it over their entire huge you know what I'm saying? Like that, there's something about that. It just doesn't kind of make sense. There's more to it, you know?
Settler experiment program. There was an official investigation into the Nazino incident, but the findings were never made public at the time. Several local officials and guards were given short prison sentences or dismissed from office. In the mid-1980s, the human rights group Memorial made the details of their findings public after they had investigated the episode themselves. A memorial cross was placed on the island in 1993 to remember those who had lost their lives there. The inscription on its plaque reads, "To the victims of political repression, 1933 to 1993. And every June, the local villagers from Nazino cross the river and place a wreath on the memorial.
Alright guys, we'll go ahead and end it right there. So yeah, just a lot of, I guess, a lot of open-ended questions there, because again, my questions are, where were the guards staying, and where were the villagers thinking? Because I know that they heard all those gunshots, all that craziness, and I'm sure a few bodies, out of a few thousand, I'm sure a few bodies washed up over there where they were. So just kind of crazy to think about. But again, thank you guys again for joining me on another episode of Mike's Intellectual Corner. I'll see you guys on another one. I'm out. Peace.